So we've seen already that consumer spending represents about two-thirds of GDP in the United States and a little over 50% of GDP in Europe. And so consumer behavior is going to impact aggregate demand quite a bit. And one of the reasons, besides current income, that it might affect aggregate demand and why they might change their spending is if they feel like they don't have the level of wealth that they want to have. And so one of the things that happened in the Great Recession was that people felt that their wealth was higher than it turned out to be. And so when the price of housing fell, their wealth fell, and they decided they needed to save more money. And when you save more money, that means you spend less money. And it's always important to remember in macroeconomics that one person's spending is another person's income. So if a lot of households decide to decrease their spending, then firms don't need to produce as much, they don't need to hire as many workers, and you end up with less total output and less total income. And so we're going to take a look at this in terms of how to think about wealth and what happens when wealth falls below some target. So let's think about how much wealth a household actually has. So for most people, right, outside of the very wealthy, wealth is mainly from expected future earnings. So if you're 30 years old, you might not have a lot of financial wealth, you might not have much or any equity in a house, but you have some expected future earnings. And so that's going to be the bulk of most people's wealth. I expect to earn 40,000 this year, 42,000 the next year. You add it all up, that's a lot of wealth. That's where you are. All right. Now, on top of that, we have financial wealth. And as we said, for a lot of people, their financial wealth is negligible or zero, right? People start building up financial wealth in retirement accounts, so things like 401ks, IRAs, and of course the very rich have a large amount of financial wealth, but for the middle class families, even upper middle class families, their financial wealth is usually fairly minimal. On the other hand, for a lot of families, their home equity is one of the bigger pieces of their wealth. And so home equity is the difference between the value of your house and the mortgage that you're paying. And so we'll see this in just a minute, but for instance, if you have a $300,000 home and you owe $200,000 on your mortgage, then your home equity is just 300 minus 200 or $100,000. So that's what we call your total broad wealth, right? How much you are worth. But on top of that, people usually have debt, right? And so if we want to think about net worth or net wealth, then we need to subtract the debt from the wealth. And so we end up with a smaller amount of net worth. So if we think about the value of the house, right, it could be, as we said, $300,000, $400,000. It could be $150,000. One of the interesting things is how much the value of a similar house varies from region to region. And so the home equity is just equal to the total value of the house minus the amount of mortgage debt that you have on it. And for a lot of people, mortgage debt is their biggest debt. Of course, one of the things that's going on right now is that people are graduating from college with more and more student loan debt, and that can impact their financial decisions as well. So imagine that we have some target value of broad wealth. All right, people think, all right, well, I want to be around here so that I can pay for my kids' college education, so I can retire, so I can go on a vacation, etc. So what happens then if that broad wealth falls, right? And so what we saw both in the Great Depression and in the Great Recession in 2008, 2009 was that people's wealth fell. And so they increased their savings in order to get that wealth back up to where it was. The problem with increasing your savings is that when everybody increases their savings, spending falls, and therefore output falls. It's often known as the paradox of thrift. And so we're going to sort of talk about this both in terms of the Great Depression and the Great Recession, this sort of role of precautionary savings, trying to get your wealth back to some target level. All right, so imagine that we are at some place, say in early 1929 or in 2007, 2008, where we're at our target broad wealth. Um, One of the interesting things about consumer behavior is that they almost never think they have more than wealth than they need. And so when the asset bubbles crashed, the stock market in 1929 and the housing market in 2007, 2008, that meant that people's home equity fell as the unemployment rate as the unemployment rate went up. That means their expected future earnings from employment fell. When the stock market crashed, that meant that their financial wealth fell, but their debt stayed the same, right? And that was an important key, is that your debt stays the same. So unless you are able to walk away from your mortgage, walk away from your margin loans that you use to buy stocks, then your debt still has to be repaid. And so what people needed to do was to increase their savings in order to restore their target wealth. But of course, that meant that people were spending less.